Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. I trust you guys are waking up, feeling refreshed, ready to begin a new day. Today is Thursday, December the 15th, and we get to spend another morning here together. So, how's everyone's shopping coming along for Christmas? Getting close to countdown. A lot of busyness on each of our campuses. Looking forward to celebrating all of these holidays with you and trusting that we always keep Jesus at the forefront of this season, right? Looking forward to the Christmas Eve services we're going to be having. We have them at 5, at 8, and at 10 on our Greenland campus. In our Kittery main campus, we will have a service at 7, and at Raymond, another at 6 and 8. So quite a few opportunities for families to gather together. Music's going to be awesome, and as always, try to keep Jesus front and center. You know, we've been in a series during this Advent season called God's People Living Generously. And it was taking a look at the incarnation and seeing that as a model of generosity, where God the Father gave that which was most precious to him, his Son. Jesus comes, gives his life. Mary gave her future, Joseph his reputation, the shepherds their time, and the Magi their money. So it's a way, right, for us to recognize that in the coming of Jesus, there is this model of generosity, of people who are giving, who are concerned not only for themselves, but for also, those around them. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. See, that's this whole text, right? Well, this week, we've been looking at Jesus's comments on the parable of the dishonest manager. And while the dishonest manager was really inept in doing his job, he was commended for the way in which he was shrewd in dealing with his circumstances to provide a better future for himself. And so his methodology wasn't being commended. It was just, he was being commended on how shrewd he was in making his future a little bit better. Jesus then turns around and says that the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of the light. So he draws this contrast then in this parable between noting how when our preoccupation is with this life and making our lives better, people could become pretty shrewd. But he says, why are we not being as shrewd as the children of the light? And in other words, if we're the citizens of heaven, we ought to be looking at ways in which we are engaging this world, but in a very different manner, right? So in Luke chapter 16, Jesus would say this at the end of this parable. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. And this whole idea then of being welcomed into eternal dwellings demonstrates to you and me that we have been called, right, to what? To make certain that we are handling this life and the resources that we have in this life with an eternal perspective. That this life is not all there is. There is going to come a day when the resources of this world, right, the worldly wealth that we enjoy, it's going to be gone. You can't take it with you. And what Jesus is saying is giving us a heads up that how we use those resources in this life has everything to do with how we are going to be welcomed into eternal dwellings, right? I mentioned at the close of our time yesterday a passage that I'd like to bring to your attention, and that was a passage that's found in Luke chapter 12. And I just thought I'm going to shift gears a little bit here this morning, but I thought that would be a good text to take a look at. And if you join me there, I'll share a couple of insights from another story here. He says, this is in verse 13. He says, someone in the crowd said, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me, right? So there was an inheritance that came, and Jesus replies, says, who appointed me judge or arbiter between you? And then he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, because a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So somehow or another, as can unfortunately happen in families, people fighting over money, who's getting what, how much he got, how much I get, and it becomes a struggle that very often can divide families. And Jesus goes right to the heart of their dispute, and he says, you gotta be on your guard against all kinds of greed. And so he says, because a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. We're more than the stuff that we have. If all of our sense of identity, right, comes from our stuff, you see how flimsy of a foundation that can be. It may work in certain circles, but Jesus is giving us a hint. Like, the mortality of one's life is going to demonstrate soon enough that your life doesn't consist in the abundance of your possessions. It may be something that you smirk at now, but eventually a time is coming, and this truth is going to be underscored. Only we waste so much time and so much of our life pursuing things that are never going to bring about the sense of fulfillment. Well, listen to this parable that Jesus says. He says, the ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And then he says, hey, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. So I want you to just pause for a moment and think about the perspective that this man has on this bumper crop that he is enjoying. This really good crop comes, and he turns around and he says, hey, I don't have enough room to store all of this. So what am I going to do? I'll build bigger barns. And that way I can store all of this crop. But notice what he says in verse 19. In verse 19, he said, in verse 18, verse 19, he says to himself, you have plenty of good things laid up for yourself for many years. So take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. What are the assumptions that are being made in his little response right there? You realize that he's equating having an abundance with what? Long life. He says, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. The assumption is that he's going to be around for those many years to enjoy all of this stuff. So when he says, hey, take life easy, eat, drink, be merry, the other side of this is not only is he acquainting his, bumper crop, right? All of this plenty that he has with long life, he also thinks it's all for him. and it's his crop, right? But notice what Jesus will say to him through this parable. It says, but God says to him, you fool. He says, this very night, your life will be demanded from you. And then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? So the assumption that having plenty meant a long life, the assumption that having plenty meant that it was all for you to spend as you wish, eat, drink, be merry. Jesus says to him in the parable, he calls him a fool. And the word for fool there is an interesting Greek word. It's the word that you get, that speaks of someone who's not very perceptive, right? He's saying to him, look, tonight your life will be demanded from you. See, our mortality, right, is right there in front of us. That's why Jesus says, look, you ought to use worldly wealth to gain friends so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. This guy here, he thinks it's all for him. It's all just for his own enjoyment, and that he's going to have a long life now because he's got, all this, stored up. But who has those guarantees about one's life? The brevity of this life, the mortality of our life, the temporary nature of this life is always pushing us to make sense, to come up with a sense of meaning and purpose for this life. And that's where the gospel of the kingdom comes in. This kingdom of heaven that Jesus has been proclaiming is telling us that there is more to this life, right, than the abundance of one's possessions. That one day you're going to leave this life, and the way the biblical record presents it is like one day we're going to stand before a holy God and give an account for one's life. So he says, he says, you fool, this very night your life is going to be demanded from you. And then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? You see, he thought it was all for him. Somebody else is going to get it now. And then maybe it's just like in the beginning of this parable where we had brothers fighting over their property and demanding Jesus to say, who's going to get this? Then you see it's like the cycle returns all over again. You got brothers fighting over this inheritance when the one who had that inheritance maybe thought it was all for him, just like this rich man. So the rich man's thinking, hey, this is a long life now. I have it made in the shade. Only his life is taken from him. And then what? Left for people to argue about again? And that's why Jesus says, look, a man's life doesn't consist in the abundance of his possessions. Otherwise, this is going to be a vicious cycle. And we see it repeated over and over and over again, right? Notice what Jesus says at the end here in verse 21. He says, this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not what? Rich towards God. See that word rich again? Did we not just read that in Luke 16, where it compared worldly wealth with true riches? And those true riches, are the things that God cares about, that we are investing in. And if you notice, it says flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. So that means what is going to inherit kingdom of heaven? People. Souls, right? And redeemed souls. People who have come to a knowledge of Christ and now have demonstrated that in their life. So that it wasn't just with their lips that they made these professions, but their hearts were also engaged. They believed. It's with They believed in their heart, and with their mouth they confessed that Jesus is Lord. And they go out to live that way. Those are the ones who inherit the kingdom of heaven. They inherit an inheritance that is God's. It's his property. And he is now going to bestow that on each and every one who by faith now has embraced him. Come into the kingdom prepared for you from the very foundations of the world, is what God will say. He is more than willing to share his things with us. But if we think that it's only about us here, then we're going to be shrewd in the way in which we're handling worldly wealth to make our lives easy in this life. But what's going to happen when we're facing eternity? See, Jesus says, this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself but is not rich towards God. And how we become rich in the things towards God is that we make God's priorities our priorities. We begin to care about what God cares about. And that becomes the big game changer then, doesn't it? That's why Jesus says, why are you going to store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal? But you ought to store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and thieves cannot break and steal. Because this is always going to be about, a weighing of the value system in one's life. That's why I love that passage in Matthew chapter 6, because it goes right from where your treasure is, there your heart would be also, into a discussion of values, where he says the eye is the lamp of the body, and if the eye is full of light, the whole body is full of light. But if the eye is dark, how great is that darkness? See, it's a value system now. Jesus is saying, look, if you're living this life with my values, you're going to be rich towards the things of God, because you're going to realize that your life is more than just the abundance of your possessions. That's a hard lesson, isn't it? That for all of us. I mean, it's not like a one and done, like, oh, I get it, thank you, and I move on. No, we're learning that lesson over and over again. We don't realize sometimes how locked in we are to the things around us. But this is the challenge. This is why we're here, right? We're to be reminded of these words, not to allow ourselves to get carried away. Hey, how many times have you read or listened to a commercial or something where they talk about, you only live once? There was that slogan going around for a while, YOLO, YOLO, you only live once. And while people got that, because it's hard to deny one's mortality, but they weren't going the next lap around the track, realizing that because you only live once, you have to make this one life count. And the way to make that count is making certain that you're being rich towards God and not solely looking at your identity in the abundance of one's possessions. Big difference, right? Because now listen to all those commercials. The commercials are, you only live once, so what? Eat, drink, and be merry. Go for it. Go on that vacation. Buy that car. He who dies with the most toys wins. And think about so much of our motivations regarding getting ahead and making life better when, we make this much and we spend this much. There's always this tension in one's life. And how many of us live this way, right? Where there is no cushion in that. So you can make a ton, but if you're spending a ton, look, yeah, I get it. Having a lot of resources provides some creaturely comforts. Right now, we're being treated to the drama regarding this whole debacle around this cryptocurrency, right? And this young man, 30-something years old, who seems to have duped, so many people out of fortunes. 30 years old. What was the motivations behind all of this? Power, pleasure, influence, right? And now he's looking at a lifetime in prison. Is it worth it? Was it worth it? See, that's where the counsel of Jesus is coming in. And the life of Jesus is what we are to look at and see how he invested himself in seeking to make life better for people. His whole reason to come was so that he might provide us with a life, a full life, that he would remove some of the scales from our eyes so that we can see a little bit more clearly and not become so distracted by the things that are all around us. I look at for instance this parable here, and I could see if it's only about what I'm getting and how I'm going to spend it, then this idea of one day standing before a holy God is so far removed from everyone's perspective that it's only until the end of your days that all of a sudden you come to your senses and you realize, oh my gosh, what have I done? That's why here in going back now to Luke and taking a look at this passage here in verse 16, right? The passage that we have been looking at, we take a look at this passage, and what are we reading here? In verse 10, right? Whoever can be trusted with a little will be trusted with much. And then in verse 11, it makes the contrast between worldly wealth and true riches. So you got this contrast, right, between little and much. So worldly wealth, when compared to the true riches, it says it's like comparing little to much. And as we just read in chapter 12, we want to make sure that not that you're just rich in the things of this world, because you can't take it with you, and it's so precarious to set one's life up that way, especially when we are going to stand before this God who has given us life and breath and give an account. He says, no, God wants to trust you with the true riches of this life. And he says in verse 12, if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? So the way in which we are conducting ourselves by the principles of the kingdom of heaven in this life is going to have everything to do with us being welcomed into these eternal dwellings. It's going to have everything to do with the way in which we are embracing this new future. So let me recap for us a little bit this morning, right? So we look at this passage in Luke chapter 12 of a rich man who has to build bigger barns to accommodate the plenty that has been brought into his life. But he makes the wrong conclusion. He looks at all this abundance and says, hey, take thine ease. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. Because he thinks that having plenty meant a long life. It meant that he was going to get to spend all of that. And yet, it was just the opposite that happened. He's dead, and now, more likely than not, people are out there, trying to divide up his property now, and fighting over who's going to get his stuff. And Jesus is saying to you and me, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. That what we ought to be about is not just storing up things for ourselves, but we ought to be living a life rich towards God. That's why we're engaged in this series during this Advent season, a season that is noted for its, celebrations and parties and gift giving. And there are many during this Christmas season who give generously and who are doing wonderful things with their resources. And they ought to be commended. And God sees their actions, and he says he will reward them. But for many, it becomes the size of the wallet, that their life really does consist in the abundance of their possessions. And it's such a flimsy foundation on which to build one's life, because it's fraught with events that we have no control over, chief of which is this life that we now possess. So the bottom line here is, again, that God's people ought to be living generously, really pursuing true riches, which means that we care about what God cares about, and our lives are demonstrating that in the way in which we are using our resources, supporting the Lord's work, helping those, who are feeling the real pressure of life, not giving to alleviate people's laziness or slothfulness. The Bible doesn't tell us to do that. It says if a man doesn't work, neither let him eat. But there are circumstances, right, that people find themselves in, that someone lending a helping hand, coming alongside, bringing a meal, buying them a coat, filling up a tank of oil, not to mention having opportunities for people to hear this good news of the kingdom. Those are all things that I think God cares about. And if he cares about, we should care about. It's all about God's people living generously, reminding ourselves that a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions, that we are not just to be storing up treasures for ourselves, but we ought to be rich towards God. Well, that's a good word, I think, to begin a new day. It's a good word to make sure that it gives us a sense of focus, of perspective. And so, my friends, I pray that these words, they would challenge us to just step in a little bit more into what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And remember that God is good all the time. Lord willing, we'll conclude our time tomorrow. If you want a little bit of a heads up, I want to take you to an Old Testament passage called 1 Chronicles chapter 29. You could read that. Great passage, and we'll take a look at it tomorrow. But you go today knowing God is good all the time. And Lord willing, we'll spend some more time tomorrow. God bless.